Have you ever just stopped and wondered, what is law? I mean, really, we live our lives by it, but where does it get its power? Well, today we're going to dive into one of the most powerful and maybe simplest answers ever cooked up. It's a theory that says all law is basically just a command. So let's get right to it. Is the law just an order from whoever's in charge? A rule you follow because, well, you have to? This is the very heart of a huge idea in legal thinking called the command theory, and we are going to pull it apart piece by piece.
Now, this idea didn't just pop up overnight. Nope. It was built up over centuries by three really brilliant and pretty different minds. We're going to start with Thomas Hobbes, the guy who laid the whole foundation. Then we'll see how Jeremy Bentham came along and tried to turn it all into a science. And finally, we'll get to John Austin, who took everything and boiled it down to this perfect, super memorable formula.
So what really makes a law? Our whole story here kicks off by asking why we even need them in the first place. And for our first thinker, the answer was pretty dark. It was to save us from ourselves. And that brings us to Thomas Hobbes. For him, law wasn't some fancy abstract concept. No, it was the one and only thing standing between humanity and total chaos. The real question for Hobbes wasn't just, what is law? It was, why on earth would any of us ever agree to be ruled by someone else? And this right here perfectly sums up his whole argument. On one side, you've got what Hobbes called the state of nature. Think of a world with no rules, no government. He said it would be a constant war of everyone against everyone. Life, in his famous words, would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Yikes. The only way out, he argued, was to make a deal. We all agree to obey a common power, a sovereign. We give up some of our freedom, and in return, we get safety, we get order, we get to escape the chaos. Okay, now Hobbes' solution is pretty extreme, and it has some really powerful critics. For some, by making any government seem better than chaos, he kind of opens the door for totalitarian rule. And feminist scholars point out a massive blind spot. His whole theory is built on this idea of lonely, warring men. It completely ignores that people are born into families, into communities. It forgets that human connection, especially for women, is where society starts, not with some isolated guy his theory is imagining. All right, so Hobbes gives us the why. We need a powerful ruler to stop us from descending into chaos. Now let's jump forward to our next thinker, Jeremy Bentham. Bentham looked at Hobbes's raw idea and thought, okay, we can make this cleaner, more rational, more scientific. He wanted to get rid of all the fuzzy, feel-good moral stuff and just focus on what law is. And let me tell you, this guy did not mince words. Back then, a lot of people talked about natural rights, given by God or nature. Bentham's response? He called it simple nonsense. Nonsense upon stilts. Just what a phrase. For him, these were just empty words. He wanted to look at law for what it was, a real, concrete tool of government power, not some mystical moral code from the heavens. And this right here is Bentham's big move. He said if we want to think clearly about law, we have to ask two totally different questions. First, what law is? That's a factual question. It's about power. It's about government. Second, what law ought to be? That's a moral question, totally separate. Now for him, the answer to the moral question was utility. The law should create the greatest happiness for the greatest number. But he insisted you can never, ever mix up what the law is with what you wish it was. And if you want a powerful image that captures Bentham's whole view on law as a tool of control, look no further. This is his design for a prison, the panopticon. The guard in the center can see into every cell, but the prisoners can't see the guard. So you never know if you're being watched, which means you have to act like you're always being watched. For a lot of people, this is the perfect symbol for how Bentham saw the law, a system of control designed to shape how we all behave. So Hobbes gave us the reason we need a ruler. Bentham separated law from morality, and now we get to our third and final thinker, John Austin. He was Bentham's student, and his true genius was taking all these ideas and distilling them down into one of the most famous, clear-cut definitions in the history of law. And there it is. So simple, so elegant, so powerful. For Austin, a law has exactly three ingredients: a command from a sovereign with a sanction attached. That's it. If you've got all three, you've got law. If you're missing even one, sorry, not a law. Let's just break this formula down really quick, because every single part is crucial. First, you need the command. That's just a wish from a superior that you do something or not do something. Second, it has to come from a sovereign. That's the person or group at the very top, the one that everybody else is used to obeying but who doesn't obey anyone higher up. And finally, you need the sanction. That's the threat, the penalty, or evil, as Austin put it, that's coming your way if you don't follow the command. Now, when we hear the word sanction, our minds probably jump to prison or a massive fine. But for Austin, the definition was way, way broader. A sanction, in his words, could be the smallest chance of the smallest evil. So even a tiny inconvenience could count. The only thing that matters is that there's some kind of negative consequence for disobeying, no matter how small it is. So that's it. The command theory, built layer by layer, from Hobbes to Bentham to Austin. It's a really clean, simple picture of what law is. But how well does it actually hold up in the real world? What are its biggest strengths and its biggest weaknesses? Okay, let's look at the scorecard. On the plus side, its number one advantage is clarity. It gives you a super simple test for what is and isn't a law. And it's realistic, right? It focuses on power and obedience, which are definitely real things in the world. But the disadvantages, they're huge. It has a really hard time explaining stuff like international law, where there's no single world leader, or constitutional law, which is supposed to limit the government's power. It really oversimplifies things, reducing the whole complex world of law down to just orders and threats. And maybe worst of all, just like Hobbes' theory, it can be used to justify tyranny. If a dictator's in charge and people are scared enough to obey, well, according to this theory, his commands are law. And that leads us to our final big, provocative question, one that really gets to the heart of the biggest problem with this whole idea. If law is nothing more than a command from someone with power, backed up by a threat, then what's the real difference between the government and a gunman? What separates the tax collector from a mugger on the street? It's a question that forces us to ask if law needs something more than just brute force to be, law.